Imagine a queen so powerful she could bend Rome's greatest generals to her will. A woman who smuggled herself into Julius Caesar's palace, rolled up in a carpet. Who sailed down a river dressed as a goddess to seduce Mark Antony, and who, in the end, chose to die with a venomous serpent rather than live as someone else's prize. This isn't just a love story. It's a story of ambition, betrayal, and the fall of a dynasty. This is Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and the queen who nearly changed the fate of Rome forever. When we think of Cleopatra, we often imagine a queen wrapped in silk, draped in gold, charming the most powerful men of her time. But her story begins in chaos, in a world where survival meant more than beauty, and intelligence was often the sharpest weapon. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC, a child of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek rulers who had controlled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. Unlike the pharaohs of old, the Ptolemies were outsiders ruling over a proud Egyptian people, and by the time Cleopatra came into the world, the dynasty was fractured with rivalries and betrayal. She was the daughter of Ptolemy the Witheened, a king mocked as Orleats, the flute player, because he was more interested in music than ruling. His weakness left Egypt vulnerable, drowning in debt to Rome. From her earliest days, Cleopatra understood that the throne was never secure. She grew up in the palace at Alexandria, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, where marble temples stood beside libraries filled with knowledge. But even as a child, she would have seen the whispers of court conspiracies, the scheming of courtiers, and the endless tug-of-war with Rome. Unlike her siblings, Cleopatra made a choice. She would not be just another figurehead queen. She trained herself to stand apart. She studied philosophy, politics, and languages, becoming fluent in not only Greek and Egyptian but several others. Ancient writers claimed she could speak as many as 9 languages, which allowed her to meet foreign dignitaries without interpreters. This was more than a skill, it was power. But power came at a cost. When her father died in 51 BC, the young Cleopatra was just 18 years old. According to custom, she was forced to share the throne with her younger brother, Ptolemy III, who was only 10. But behind that child king stood his advisors, ruthless men who saw Cleopatra as a threat. The early years of her reign were a storm. Cleopatra tried to rule independently, signing her own decrees, even putting her face on coins as the true monarch. But soon the tension with her brother's court exploded. She was driven out of Alexandria, forced into exile in the desert with only a few loyal followers. Imagine the scene. The young queen, stripped of her throne, watching from afar as her brother's forces took control of her city. But Cleopatra was not defeated. She carried with her something far more dangerous than an army, her ambition. She waited, watched, and planned, and soon she would meet the man who would change her life and the fate of Egypt forever, Julius Caesar. Cleopatra's exile could have been the end of her story. Many rulers of her dynasty had been forgotten, swallowed up by the endless politics of Egypt and Rome. But Cleopatra wasn't the kind of woman to disappear quietly. She was waiting for the right moment, and in 48 BC, that moment arrived. Rome itself was in turmoil. Julius Caesar, one of the most powerful generals in history, had just defeated his great rival Pompey in a bloody civil war. Pompey fled to Egypt hoping for refuge, but instead was betrayed and killed on the orders of young Ptolemy III's advisors. When Caesar landed in Alexandria, expecting to find an ally, he was horrified to be presented with the severed head of Pompey. Egypt's rulers thought they were pleasing him, but in truth, they had insulted him deeply. This was Cleopatra's chance. She knew Caesar was not just a soldier, he was a kingmaker. If she could win his support, she could take back her throne. But how could an exiled queen gain access to the most powerful man in the world when her enemies controlled the palace? This is where legend and history intertwine. Ancient writers tell us that Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled up in a rug, or possibly a linen sack. Imagine the scene: Caesar, exhausted from war, sitting in the palace chambers when his guards carry in a bundle. They unroll it, and out steps Cleopatra, young, radiant, and bold. She wasn't simply beautiful, though many accounts agree she had a presence that could not be ignored. She was confident, witty, and utterly fearless. Caesar was intrigued. He was 52, experienced and hardened by decades of war. Cleopatra was 21, but she spoke with intelligence, offering not only her charm, but a vision of what Egypt could be under her rule. It wasn't long before their political alliance became something more. They became lovers, and with Caesar's support, Cleopatra marched back into Alexandria to face her brother's forces. The city erupted into war, streets filled with smoke and blood as Caesar's legions clashed with the Egyptians. At one point, the great library of Alexandria is said to have caught fire in the chaos, though historians still debate how much was truly lost. Eventually, Caesar triumphed, and Ptolemy III drowned in the Nile while fleeing the battle. Cleopatra emerged victorious, not just as a survivor, but as Egypt's rightful queen. To secure her position further, she bore Caesar a son, whom she named Caesarion. To her people, he was proof of divine favor. To Rome, he was a living link between Egypt and their most powerful man. Cleopatra was no longer just a queen in exile. She was a queen reborn, standing beside Caesar, ready to shape history. But in Rome, whispers began. Caesar already had a wife, and his love affair with the exotic queen of Egypt was a scandal that many senators would never forget. For a brief moment, Cleopatra stood at the height of her power. She had secured her throne, restored stability to Egypt, and gained the protection of the most powerful man in the world. With Caesar at her side and her son Caesarion in her arms, she imagined a dynasty that could rule not only Egypt, but perhaps influence Rome itself. But history is rarely kind to such dreams. When Caesar returned to Rome, Cleopatra followed. She sailed up the Tiber River in a golden barge, dressed as the goddess Isis, with servants fanning her and musicians playing. Rome had seen generals parade their victories before, but never had it seen a queen arrive with such splendor. Crowds gawked, fascinated and scandalized. To the Romans, she was exotic, dangerous, and unforgettable. Inside Rome's political heart, however, Cleopatra was not welcomed so warmly. Senators whispered that Caesar was bewitched, that this foreign queen had too much influence. They mocked the idea that Caesar might crown himself king with Cleopatra as his queen, ending the republic forever. Some even feared Caesarion as a rival heir to Caesar's legacy, a child who might one day unite Egypt and Rome under one throne. In 44 BC, the whispers turned into steel. On the Ides of March, Caesar entered the Senate unarmed, believing himself untouchable. But his closest allies turned against him. The first dagger struck, then another, until the room filled with the sound of steel tearing into flesh. 23 wounds later, the most powerful man in Rome lay bleeding at the feet of Pompey's statue. And among the conspirators was Brutus, a man Caesar had once treated as a son. The news shattered Cleopatra. In an instant, her protector was gone, and with him, her safety in Rome. She was no longer the queen who stood beside Caesar. She was now a foreign widow with a young child, surrounded by men who wanted her gone. Without hesitation, she fled back to Egypt, carrying Caesarion and her fragile dreams with her. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra knew she had to tread carefully. Rome was once again in civil war, with two figures rising to power: Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, and Octavian, Caesar's young adopted heir. Both men sought control of Rome, and both men would shape Cleopatra's fate. At first, she tried to remain neutral, securing Egypt's borders and rebuilding her strength. But Cleopatra understood that Egypt could never truly stand apart from Rome. If she wanted her throne, and her son's future secured, she would need another ally in Rome's brutal game of power. That ally would soon arrive. Not in secret like Caesar had years before, but with a command that shook the ancient world. His name was Mark Antony, and he would change Cleopatra's life in ways even she could not have predicted. When Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra in 41 BC, it was not just a meeting of two leaders, it was the beginning of one of history's most famous romances. Antony, a veteran general and loyal ally of the late Caesar, now ruled the eastern provinces of Rome. But he needed Egypt's wealth to finance his ambitions. Cleopatra knew this was her moment to secure her throne and her son's future. The stage was set in the city of Tarsus. Cleopatra refused to arrive like a supplicant queen. Instead, she sailed up the river on a golden barge with purple sails billowing in the wind, oars of silver flashing in the sun. She reclined beneath a canopy, dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by servants dressed as cupids and musicians playing soft melodies. The air was filled with perfume so strong that the crowd swore the street smelled of her presence long before she arrived. Antony, a man who had fought countless battles, was stunned. This was not diplomacy, it was theater, and Cleopatra knew exactly how to play the role. She invited him to feast, offering nights filled with banquets where the tables groaned under the weight of food and wine, where laughter mixed with politics, and where Antony found himself captivated not just by her beauty, but by her wit, her intelligence, and her ability to command a room. It was not long before politics turned into passion. Antony followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria, where the two began a life of indulgence and extravagance. They formed what came to be known as the inimitable livers, a society dedicated to pleasure, games, and feasting. They dressed as gods, roamed the streets in disguise, and lived in a way that scandalized Rome but thrilled the people of Alexandria. Yet beneath the romance lay politics. Antony needed Egypt's wealth and military support. Cleopatra, in turn, needed Antony's power to secure her son Caesarion's claim and protect Egypt from Roman annexation. Together, they envisioned a dynasty that could rival Octavian's ambitions in Rome. Their bond produced 3 children, further tying their fates together, but as their love grew, so too did their enemies. In Rome, Octavian spread propaganda that Antony had fallen under the spell of a dangerous foreign queen. He painted Cleopatra as a scheming temptress who had seduced Antony and made him betray his Roman heritage. He told the Senate that Antony planned to move Rome's capital to Alexandria, making Rome a servant of Egypt. Whether these stories were true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed them. For Cleopatra and Antony, the stakes could not have been higher. They were not just lovers. They were partners in a struggle for power that reached across the Mediterranean. Their romance was a fire burning against the tide of Roman politics, and though it burned brightly, the shadows of war were already gathering on the horizon. By 32 BC, the world was divided. On one side stood Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, building his power in Rome. On the other stood Mark Antony and Cleopatra, ruling from Alexandria as king and queen. What had once been a love affair was now a political gamble, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of Rome itself. The conflict came to a head at sea, in the waters off Greece, at a place called Actium. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a massive fleet, their ships larger and stronger than Octavian's. But Octavian had something even more powerful: strategy and propaganda. He told the Roman people that this was not Antony's war at all, but Cleopatra's, that a foreign queen was trying to enslave Rome. By the time the battle began, Antony's allies were already deserting him. The clash was brutal. Ships slammed into each other, soldiers fought hand to hand, and the air filled with fire and smoke. In the chaos, Cleopatra made a desperate decision. She turned her fleet and retreated. Seeing her sail away, Antony abandoned the fight and followed. To their enemies, it looked like betrayal. To historians, it was a fatal mistake. Without their leaders, the fleet crumbled. Octavian had won. The lovers fled back to Alexandria, but the walls of their empire were closing in. Antony, broken and humiliated, watched as his legions deserted him. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, tried to negotiate with Octavian, even testing whether she might save Egypt by aligning herself with him. But Octavian was ruthless. He wanted Egypt, and he wanted Cleopatra destroyed, not as a queen, but as a symbol. In the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's army marched into Alexandria. Defeat was inevitable. When Antony heard false news that Cleopatra had already taken her own life, he fell on his sword in despair. Mortally wounded, he was carried to Cleopatra, who was still alive and died in her arms. It was the final tragic act of a man who had given everything for love and ambition. Cleopatra now faced a choice: live and be paraded through Rome as Octavian's trophy, or die as a queen. She chose death. The most famous account tells us she arranged for a basket of figs to be brought to her chambers, hiding within it a venomous asp. She dressed in her royal robes, lay upon her golden couch, and pressed the serpent to her skin. The poison coursed through her veins, and the last pharaoh of Egypt slipped away, leaving behind mystery, legend, and the eternal symbol of a woman who lived and died on her own terms. When Octavian entered her chamber, it was too late. Cleopatra was gone, her story already becoming myth. Rome would take Egypt, Caesarion would be killed, and Octavian would become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. But Cleopatra's name would live on, not as a mere queen, but as a legend of love, power, and tragic destiny. And so Cleopatra's life ended as dramatically as she had lived, wrapped not in silk and gold, but in legend. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, while her Egypt was reduced to just another province in his empire. Yet Cleopatra refused to be remembered as a trophy. She chose her own ending, leaving behind a story that has outlived the empire that tried to erase her. More than 2,000 years later, we still speak her name, not just as a queen, not just as a lover, but as a symbol of power, intelligence, and a woman who dared to stand against Rome itself. Her death was a tragedy, but her legacy is eternal.